You would do anything in the world for your kids. You want the absolute best for them, and you've given it a lot of thought. You know that you want things to be different than what you've seen around you in your own childhood or in other families. Some of the things that you know are that you don't want mom guilt. You are absolutely sure that's not the way that you want to do things. No mom guilt, no shaming of yourself or your children. And you've also figured out that you don't want to do those oppressive parenting practices. Definitely no spanking. And if you have given it some deeper thought, deeper research, maybe no punishment and even no yelling. And at the end of the day, you don't want to be exhausted. So how do you do that? If you've decided that you don't want guilt, shame, spanking, yelling, how do you create the other things that you want? Because you have a lot of other dreams for yourself, with your partner, in your family, in your work out in the world, and especially for your kids. For your kids, what you do want is to have a wonderful experience. You want them to have all that they could possibly have. You want to be a better mother. You want to do everything in your power to be a better mother, but not through the mom guilt. So what does that look like? Well, you want your children to be responsible. You want responsible kids, kind kids. And at the end of the day, you want to raise mature adults. And if you're still watching this, it goes beyond that. Yeah, you want to be kind and mature and responsible, but you want your children to become loving, giving human beings. How do you do all that? Especially if you're not going to do any of these things over here. How do you set the boundaries that you need to? How do you deal with it when they're throwing tantrums or hitting friends or throwing a fit in the middle of school? How do you do all that? And especially, how do you do it and reject exhaustion? And you know, sometimes you don't manage that part, do you? Sometimes at the end of the day, you regret some of the choices that you made. Maybe you yelled. You definitely were not in the place you wanted to be with them the whole day. So when you're in that exhausted space, sometimes it just comes down to you don't want to blow it. You just want to not blow it. And I get it. I'm Susan Zink, and I'm mothering mentor to the new 1%. And this is a whole different ballgame. This is a whole different way of interacting with our children. And in this video, I'm going to share with you my system, the whole system, everything that I have come up with that is the bottom line for how you do this and do it all. Reject all those things you don't want, claim all the things you do want in your home, your big work in the world, and especially for what you do to help your children be the best that they can be. So when I say that 1%, new 1%, what do I mean? Well, I do mean abundance. I do mean success. But I mean even more something that lays under it. I'm talking about the love. I'm talking about living a life that is guided by love and guiding our children with love moment to moment, every day, as deeply and profoundly as we can. So what does that look like? What I'm going to tell you is that there's 3 pieces that have to be in place for that to happen. Radical respect, radical responsibility, and radical relatedness. And I'm going to go through those and kind of make my case for them, but there's a simpler way to say it. It's live is love. Radical respect is living. It's living and landing and being present in the moment and appreciating every bit of it and giving your whole self to it. And the as in live is love is seeing the world as it is. Taking radical responsibility is just seeing the world as it is. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then that key piece, love, radical relatedness, owning the connections between all of us. So, my system, radical respect, radical responsibility, radical relatedness, live as love. So let's start with that radical respect. Well, what does that look like? What does that look like with your kids? What does that look like out in the world? Well, with your kids, it looks like some pretty simple things from my perspective, and things that I see a lot of really loving, really caring moms not doing. Simple things like eye contact before you communicate with your children. Giving them that sense that you respect them by asking their permission before you touch them, and then waiting for a signal. And the reason I say a signal is I'm talking about an infant. I'm talking about children who have no spoken language. Unless we start doing that respect from them at that very young age, how can we expect them to really learn it? And I'll talk about more about that a little bit when we talk about the developmental piece that's so key. And then there's simple things like, instead of grabbing their hand, you offer yours. But because you've set up this relationship of radical respect, they take it and they go with you and they leave daycare even when they still want to play on the bike a little bit longer. When my oldest son was born, he was 9 pounds, 12 ounces, and then he spiked a fever the day after he was born. So he was in the second level nursery. In the hospital where I had him, there was the regular nursery, the second level nursery, usually for premature babies. They were underweight and maybe they had some other problems, but they were basically healthy. And then there was level 3, where those teeny tiny ones that needed all the machines were kept alive. And I noticed something as the nurses were carrying my son around. They kind of didn't know how to do it. They were used to handling the babies like this. The little 5 or 4 pound baby's head would be here and the rest of the body here, and they could just kind of flip them around, and they had complete control, and they could give them a bottle or whatever they needed to do. Well, a 9 pound, 12 ounce baby won't fit like that. And I saw them kind of holding him like that and realizing that they couldn't do it. And the reason I tell this story is they were on autopilot, and this is not to criticize them in any way. They dealt with the babies of drug addicts because it was a hospital that was the charity hospital. And these women did the most amazing work, and I would never want to criticize them. But it's an example of a way we have to treat our children differently. We have to be present in the moment and notice what each one needs, down to how they need to be touched, because they'll tell us if we're there completely in the moment. How you do this is you model it. You model it in the way you live your adult life and the way you interact with your children. And in your adult life, there is a way of treating everyone around you with radical respect, including yourself, and it starts with you. The reason I say the first step in my system is love, which I kind of live, which I kind of translate as land, is you have to land. You have to do the self-care to be able to be present in the moment and notice those things that your mother and your grandmother didn't notice, because it's hard emotional work. And I would like you to think about the way that we treat those around us. When we go buy a $15 pair of shoes, or we get a $15 manicure, what respect are we showing for the people who made those products or provided that service to us? What are we saying to them about what their time is worth? What are we saying to them about what they are worth? If you're not putting your attention on paying others what they are worth, giving that as much attention as you give to making sure you're paid what you are worth, which I wholly endorse, you aren't modeling radical respect. And the reason is you're not respecting yourself, 9 times out of 10 in my experience. Because why do you buy that $15 pair of shoes? I would suggest that when what you really need is a day off, or what you really need is that walk in the woods at sunset, instead of feeding your soul, instead of taking the nourishment that you need at the very core of your being, in the marrow of your bones, you settle. And you settle for $15 shoes, or a $15 manicure, or junk food, or a Netflix binge. Unless you treat yourself with radical respect, you can't treat the rest of the world that way. And you can't model that for your children and teach them through your model. You have to do that first. And then you can move on to radical responsibility. Now, I would guess a lot of people listening to me have worked on using the law of attraction in their lives, using other spiritual laws or other natural laws, working in accordance with them as best they know how to create success, to create the lives that they want to create for themselves and for their children. And I wholly endorse that. But I'm going to tell you the foundation of that is radical responsibility. And what I mean by that is taking radical responsibility for creating every element of your life, every aspect of your life, every experience you draw into your life, even the ones that we consider tragedies, even the ones that unless we go really deep, we consider to have happened to us. Maybe we consider ourselves to be a victim. Maybe we consider someone else to be a victim. And I'm here to tell you, if you're going to take radical responsibility in this life, you've got to own the fact there are no victims. There are no offenders. All there are people doing their best where they are, with the level of learning they have, with the level of emotional maturity they have, with the level of courage that they have. They're doing their best. And that is something you have to own, especially if you want to teach it to your children. Because one of the things that you're going to find is anything you haven't owned in yourself, you can't teach them. And I've been hearing a lot about some really tragic experiences that have been going on. And I believe that we are so busy blaming the polluters, blaming the bankers, blaming the people who are voting for someone other than who we're voting for, or the mom who has a different picture of treating her children with respect than the one that we hold in our own heads. And it breaks my heart. I really hesitate to say this part, but I don't know a better way to get the point across. When I hear people talking about tragedies that happen, including rape, I know this is an opportunity to go deeper within inside of ourselves. Because even those things we have to take responsibility for. When I was at the University of Utah and I was in an undergraduate class and I was a little bit older than most of the other people in the class, I guess maybe 10 years old or something like that, I was in a human sexuality class and I was infuriated. The man at the front of the room in the same lecture did two things that absolutely horrified me. The first thing that he did was he invited someone from the class, from the audience, because it was a big auditorium lecture, to come up and draw, a male, to come up and draw female anatomy. And he basically shamed the young man who came up and obviously was not very familiar with his subject. And that horrified me. And then this same man, who I think may have actually been younger than me, went on to say, rape is a crime of power. And what he managed to do, in the way he explained it that way, was blame, shame, and make wrong a whole lot of people in the room and terrify pretty much everyone else. That's not the way we treat one another. And that's not the way we avoid these kinds of tragedies. We have to take radical responsibility. And I have some experience with that. I know what it's like to lose people. I know what it's like to lose the closest thing I had to a brother to violence and to forgive. Somebody gets murdered, you have some choices. You carry that burden around with you for the rest of your life, or you forgive. That's radical responsibility taking. And it leads us to the next piece. Because radical relatedness is the love. Just the love. What if that really is all that there is? What if that really is all human beings are? Every single human being. Just a different expression of love. Because I believe it is. I believe that is what we are. I believe that's what our world is. Just every one of us is a different expression of love. And I believe we make agreements. I believe we make agreements to teach that to one another, even when it's really hard. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I had an experience when I was very young of losing my dad when I was 9 and he drowned. And part of me knows that was the way it was supposed to be. Part of me knows that hard experience was exactly the way things were supposed to be. What if we made an agreement? Maybe that was what had to happen for me to learn the lessons I need to learn and him to learn the lessons he needed to learn. I don't know. I don't have the answers to that level of how it works, but I can tell you that is what radical relatedness is living at love, living as love, and relating as love at that level. So I don't want you to think that I believe I have all the answers. I absolutely don't. I do believe that a lot of times I ask the right questions, and that's what I'm hoping you're going to do, because I believe there's more magic in asking the right questions than being convinced that we have the right answer or even hoping that we do. So what about this? Even if you don't agree with some of the examples that I gave, probably, if you're still watching, you agree that responsibility, even radical responsibility, radical respect, radical relatedness with one another, those are things we want. If we do want them, why aren't they happening? Why aren't at least some of us living that way all the time? And my answer to that is the same as a lot of people's, which is fear. But I kind of think we still need to be asking that question, because we need to ask, what are we afraid of? Some people say we're afraid of the unknown, or we're afraid of death, or we're afraid of pain. I actually think, at least for those of us who are really searching, really doing our best to dig deep and give the best that we can, I believe it's something else. I believe we are afraid to be aware of our own power. Because if we were, we would know our power to hurt the ones that we love so much around us. And sometimes that's just more than we can bear. But we have to. This is the emotional hard work that we have to do. When one of my sons was in college 15 years ago, he called me up and I could tell he was upset. And he started crying. And I found out that the reason he was calling me is that he was breaking up with his girlfriend, a girlfriend of quite a good long time. And he was crying not because, he was sad because he was going to miss her. But the reason he was crying is because he knew how much it was going to hurt her. And even though he wisely knew that this was not his person to be with, this was not the woman he was going to marry, and it was a good time to do this and to make this break, that's what hurt him. And I knew he was a wonderful being who came, and I was honored to be his mom, but I knew I'd done some things right when we had that conversation. And I had a conversation with a relatively new friend when I was with some other friends recently, and she was in a kind of a new relationship, and she was questioning this relationship because the man was quite a bit older than her. And we were bantering back and forth. Some of the men were joking with her a little bit about this. And I said to her, he deserves somebody who doesn't think he's too old. These are the hard choices that we have to make. These are the choices that we have to make by digging deep. And so if we're going to do that, how do we do that? How do we practice these radical levels of respect, responsibility, and relatedness? How do we live as love? Well, I don't have all the answers, but I have a few ideas, especially in relation to how you do this with your children. So how do you practice this radical respect with your children and other people around you? Well, if you know anything about Montessori education, if you know anything about the ideas of Dr. Maria Montessori, you know that that is a huge part of that. The idea of following the child, the idea of noticing what the child's needs are, and then setting up an environment and following what you notice is working and not working. And there is a problem that I've noticed from my time in that community. And that is that a lot of times people are told to do that, but they aren't told how. And I don't mean they aren't told how like the eye contact that I mentioned, the waiting for a child to give you some indication that it's okay to touch them. They're taught those things, but they're not taught how to find it within themselves. And sometimes they're expected to do it when they're exhausted and don't have the necessary resources to set up that kind of environment. So the first thing that has to happen is you have to land. You have to do that self-care that lets you be fully present. You can't do that if you're depleted, much less exhausted. You can't do that kind of hard emotional work that you didn't have modeled for you as a child. And that's the other piece. Why can't we just do it? Why can't we just have somebody tell us, do this with your child and do it? Well, you have something working against you. You've got your own personal history and cultural history. That's in you at a very deep level. And then you just have what was modeled for you. So these are the habits that are part of what you learned growing up and the worldview. All of those just come in to you before age 6 or 7. And if you haven't actively made an attempt to change them, that's what you're going to act from. That's just the way it is. So you're going to need some kind of practices, some kind of way to move yourself out of the habitual, move yourself out of the way that you have done things in the past and step into a new way of radically respecting your children. So how do you do that? Well, one of the things that you do is that you give them the chance to learn that from you. You give them the chance to see that from the way that you model it. But also you have to take it to a developmental place. You have to honor what their developmental openings are for being able to learn things and do things in a particular way. And that relates into how do you do radical responsibility with children. One of the problems there is, a professor of mine said, you know what you know. And my counter to that is, you don't know what you don't know. And so if you are in a place where you're not aware of what your children need developmentally and what your needs are, you're stuck. And I specifically talk about this in relation to development because if you want to teach children that everything that happens in their lives, they have power over, everything that they draw into their lives, they are responsible for that result. How do you do that? And how do you do that with a child who is still thinking at a very different level than you are? I recently heard that a television show that I used to watch when I was a kid, it was made in the mid-60s and when television was still relatively new, and it's called Gilligan's Island. If you're not familiar with it, it's about some people who were shipwrecked on an island and they're kind of making their way while they're waiting to be rescued. And I found out recently that several times a week, maybe many times a week, during the time this show was on, the Coast Guard would get phone calls from people asking them to go rescue the people, the actors on Gilligan's Island. Now, if adult humans who just haven't quite completely caught up with the whole idea of television have that kind of mistaken ideas, how much more challenging is it to teach radical responsibility to children? If you have a tall, thin vase and you have a short, fat one, you can do an experiment. You can put water in the tall, thin vase and have the short, fat vase there and pour the water from the tall, thin vase into the short, fat one, or the other way around, and ask your child if there's the same amount of water. And I will guarantee you, if your child is under age 3 and probably under 4.5, that the child will say that there is more water in the tall container than there is in the short container, even if you pour it and you pour it back and forth. How on earth can you teach a child radical responsibility for everything in their life if they still think that water in a tall container magically is more water than when it's in a short container? Well, the answer is your own modeling in your own body, in your own life, and also understanding where the child is and giving them the chance to learn it, giving them more and more responsibility. It's not about you doing more for them. In fact, it's about you doing less. It's about you doing more emotional work. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, but emotional work scales. Once you've done it, you're there. And you need to be teaching your children to take on more responsibility for themselves, their self-care, and for your home, and for contributing even in their little corner of the world. That's how you teach them radical responsibility. So how do you go about living radical relatedness? How do you live this love of being connected with everyone else and teaching your children that and living from that with your kids? Well, one of the things that you do is you surround yourself with a community of women who are as committed and as diligent about living the values that you have as you are. You have to have that kind of community in order to do this. And this goes back to what I said about you don't know what you don't know. You can't see what you're not seeing about your children. And this is something that is about how we figure this out together, because it's gotten too complicated. I talked earlier about sexuality and rape and what that brings up in our culture. Sexuality is now much more complicated than it was in my mother's generation, much less her grandmother's generation. You can't just leave it at teaching consent. In this time, we are, as a human race, at least as some cultures within the human race, embracing the more complicated elements of our sexuality. We're embracing the eroticism of giving up our power willingly from our choice with people we deeply trust. When you've got that going on, you can't just leave things like teaching consent. It has to go to a different, deeper level of trust, awareness of yourself, of those around you. You have to be teaching at a level that meets that. Just teaching consent is kind of just a step or two above waiting for marriage and using violence to enforce the protection of virginity. We're beyond that, and we can't figure it out all by ourselves. One of the ways that this video came about is from the videos I've been watching. There's a woman who has taught me so much about doing videos, and she talked about one of her own creations, one of the gifts she gave out in the world, and about how she wanted her parents to be proud of it, and she thought they would be. And if my mother were alive, I think she would be proud of what I'm saying, to an extent, because some of it she wouldn't be able to understand. Because if I were having a discussion about rape with her, she'd just want to put him under the jail. And at the same time, she respected me. She respected my sons, her grandsons, at a level that showed me and modeled for me this idea our children are going to go beyond what we're going to do. She would say to me and my sons, "You're so smart." And I don't believe in that, and I don't think it's the best thing to say, but she said it from this place of love, and it was the way she could wrap her head around what we were saying and the ways we were thinking that she couldn't get to. So you've got to choose. And you've got to teach your children to choose who they're going to be around, who they're going to be up close and personal with, and who they're going to love from afar. And you have to model that by not settling, by holding your own personal boundaries and respecting yourself. That's the foundation of that level of love. And I want to mention where I kind of got the courage to put this out in this way. I am part of a community that a young businesswoman, a young business leader I deeply respect. Her name is Jen Scalia. She had been doing a challenge in her community, a video challenge. And I became so inspired by the videos I was watching and the things that people were saying. One woman shared her dream of being on Oprah, and she even shared what she would say when Oprah asked her perennial question of what does the world need more of? And I realized that her answer is the same as mine. It's love. And another woman posted and she said, "What are your words to live by?" Well, those are mine. Live is love. I know it's important, and I know I fall short, and I know I just have to pick myself up again and move on because it is important. And the way that you do this is that's what you do. You have to trust. You have to trust the perfection of everything that is all the time. You have to go out in nature so that you can ground yourself in that for when you're going to miss the mark, when you're not going to do things the best that you can. That's what you have to do. And you can do it. But it also means living your values. If you say your children are the most important thing in the world to you, you need to live that. You need to bring it, your time, bring your money to it. And most importantly, you need to bring your energy to it. So how do you be the better mother that you want to be without doing the mom guilt, without doing the shaming? Well, what you do is you trust and you deepen and expand into the idea that everything is perfect all the time, and then you notice when you need to do more. I can't say it better than Maya Angelou. You do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, you do better. That's how you do this. And you keep doing it. And you recognize when you need support. And you recognize that you need to surround yourself with other people who have the same goals and the same dedication to them that you do. One of the people I most respect in the business world, in fact, the only male that I read every day, Seth Godin says, if you aren't willing to live your values now, when are you going to start? And I'm going to challenge you. If you have had some ideas as you've been listening to this, that there are ways you can step up with your children in a different way, I'm going to ask you to do that. Whether it's with me, whether it's with someone else, if you have been investing in your business, if you've been investing in your health and in other aspects of your life with your time and your money and your attention and your energy, I encourage you, if you really would do anything in the world for your kids, and I'll tell you, even when you don't know you would, I know you would. I know that's true. If that is true, then I encourage you to invest in the same way, at the same level, with the same dedication in them. Invest in yourself as a mother. Invest in their future in the way that you know is going to serve you and serve them.